In the previous video, we started our top 10 downloader application, and we just did a very basic bit of code, and that was starting on the creation of the download data inner class, as you can see here on the screen. And just to recap, that the inner class, private class, is actually within the public class. And what I'm doing is I'm coding it down the bottom so that we can leave the main part of main activity at the top, but you could just have equally put the private in there and actually just put it in there, but I've decided to put it down the bottom, but that's personal preference. So let's go ahead now and get rid of this error and actually implement some of the code that we need so we can start downloading this file. So I've made a bit of space. I'm just going to scroll that up so we can actually see what we're doing on the screen here. So the first thing we need is a field, and that field is going to be a string, and that's going to store the data that we get back from that XML file that I showed you in the previous video. So it's going to be a private string M. We're going to call it M file contents, like so. So next, if you recall, I said that this up here was complaining that the do in background method wasn't implemented. So we're going to implement that. So I'm going to override that. So I'm going to click on the generate, and I'm going to go down and generate. By the way, for a Mac, it's Command N, but you can come up here to code and generate. I can't. It's great at the moment because I've got the generate screen or menu on the screen at the moment, but that'll show you the shortcut for your operating system. So I'm going to choose that. I'm going to go down here to override methods. And what this does, it gives you a list of the methods that can be overridden. In other words, these are functions that are built into this async task in this case, but then it's because I'm actually in this section, android.os.async task. And what we can do is we can actually write our functionality in these certain parts of these, or for these methods, I should say, and that will then perform at the appropriate time. So as I go through and implement them, I'll actually tell you what they're actually for, so they make sense. But the first one we want to do is do in background. So I'm just going to literally just click on that and click on OK. And you notice that it's done the work for us automatically. So it's actually added the method, and it's added this thing here, which does look a bit strange. So you might be looking at that, wondering what's the string ... and params. Well, that's basically come about with a relatively recent version of Java, and it's what's called a variable number of arguments. So by using string or any data type with ... on the end, what we're doing is we're saying the number of parameters can be variable, or how it works is it's actually an array. So in other words, we could pass just one file to download, we could pass 5, 10, 20, whatever number we wanted to, and it's all done within this one line. We don't have to change our code. The only thing we need to do is we would need to test ourselves to see how many links have been provided. But for simplicity, with this application, we're going to be downloading only one link. So we're just going to presume that for the parameters that have passed to this method, that literally there's only going to be one. But I just wanted to point out that the 3 dots means it's a variable number that you can actually specify. Okay, so what we need to do is change this return null, because we need to actually start implementing our code. Now, do in background, this is the code that we want to run, as it says in background. So it's sort of like saying run in background. So these are the methods that we want running without blocking, in other words, without holding up the application from doing anything else. And any code we put in this do in background method will automatically be placed in the background by Android. So we don't have to do anything else fancy or anything like that. All we have to do is put our code in here, and it will be run automatically. Then as you'll see in the next video, when we start processing the results of that actually happens in another method. So all we really want to do here is we want to invoke the download and actually store the contents of that download in this variable M file contents, and then we're actually going to return that. The rest happens automatically by Android because we're using the async task. So we don't need to worry about any more of the complexities. It's just enough to know that put the code in here that you want to run, and it's going to do the rest for you. So the code I'm going to put in here is M file contents equals, and we need to create a method which we haven't created yet. So download XML file. We're going to create that method, and we're going to pass the parameter. It's going to be params element 0. And that should have been params. So what we're saying there is to do the actual method download XML file, which we're about to write, we're passing just the very first reference, very first element in the array, bearing in mind that we could have specified a variable number of elements, but we're just going to process the first one. So that's what that means in square brackets, element 0 only. And then next we put if M file contents is equal to null. We're going to log the output. So we're going to log it, and you'll see this running when I get the emulator running in another video. But we're going to use the logger, log.d for debug. And we're going to type download data, which is the name of the class, of course. And we're just going to put a message error, downloading. Like so. And then lastly, we're just going to put return and file contents. So that's literally all this method will be. And again, bearing in mind that by putting it in this special do in background method, it's all going to happen automatically. The background things will handle things, will all work automatically. We don't need to do anything else other than putting it in there. So the next thing we need to do now is obviously implement this download XML file method, and that's going to be the code that actually does the downloading. So it's actually going to do the downloading of the actual file. So we're going to create another method. I'm going to call it private, and the return type is going to be a string. So ultimately, we're going to return the XML file because it's text. We're going to return it into a string object, and then process it in later videos based on that. And it's going to be called download XML file, as you can see there. So the parameter is going to be file path. Probably URL path would make more sense because it's a URL from the internet, like so. And then what we need is a temporary buffer, and this buffer is going to be used to store the contents of the XML file. Because depending on the size of the XML file and the way that we're creating the process, it's only going to download so many characters at a time. So we need a temporary buffer that's going to store the contents of that file. So we're going to use something that's called a string builder. I'm going to call it temp buffer equals new string builder. A string builder is just a way to create a string, another way to create a string that's a little bit more efficient. And when we get to the stage of using that, we'll talk more about that. The next thing we need to do is we need to use a try-catch block. Now that might sound like a little bit like mumbo jumbo to you, but if you think about it, when we're downloading a file, there's a chance there could be an error. Now the errors that could come up, and there's quite a few of them, some of them would be your internet goes offline. You might physically disconnect your internet from your computer, so we need to handle that error. And another situation could be Apple's websites might be offline, which does happen occasionally. There could be some other internet issue. There could be some other problem, anything of that nature. And if we don't trap an error, if we don't actually sort of say, if this error happens, I don't want you to crash, I want you to do this instead. If we don't handle that, your program is going to crash. So there's a concept called a try-catch block, and that's where we can identify, we can sort of say, if we get this type of error, I want you to perform this action instead. So that's what a try block does, a try block and catch. And we'll go through, as I'm actually typing in this code, I'll explain more as we go along. So what we're really going to do is we're going to wrap around our code that we know could crash for various reasons. We're going to put this try and the catch around that to stop that from happening, or rather it may still happen, the error, but we're going to do something if it does happen rather than just crash your program. So I'm going to type try, and then put a brace there, a left brace. And down here, I'm going to put catch, IO in uppercase like that, and then exception. I'm just going to type E like that. I've got log.d, and I'm going to type download data again. I'm going to put IO exception, reading data, e.get message. I'll explain that shortly. And the reason that's coming up at the moment, it's just coming up with an error saying, well, you're asking for a try block here. You're trying to trap an error, but there's no chance of that error happening in the code that you've actually developed yet. So it's really just giving you a friendly warning to say, well, just letting you know that it's pointless writing this code. When we actually implement some more code in here shortly, that will go away because we will be creating some code that can potentially cause an IO exception error. And what we're doing here is we're just sort of saying, if there was an error, we're going to log the error, we're going to display that, and we're going to then, that really gives us a mechanism to be able to debug our code, and we can see what the error was. And the e.get message just gives us a little bit of detail about what the specific error was. So Java, in other words, because we've specified this catch, we've said the type of error, and we've set up a variable there called e, then with e.get message, that gives us some base details about the actual error message. So we're going to log that. That's what we're going to do there for now. So we're going to go back and start writing some code. So the first thing we need to do is we need to basically start figuring out a way. Well, we're going to try and open the file first. We're going to try and actually open what's called a HTTP URL connection to see whether the file can be successfully opened. In other words, is it a valid URL, or are we going to get an error? So we're going to type URL. Now, as you're typing, these case is very important. So URL in uppercase is different to what it might be, using something like URL. So make sure that you do type the correct cases you see me typing. So URL equals new URL file path. File path being the parameter that was passed to us. Whoops. Sorry, URL path it was called, not file path. Now you notice straight away now that the IO exception error has gone, a little red underlining, and that's because this particular here, this error, this line rather, could actually throw the error IO exception. So in other words, there could be an error generated because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to open the path to, in this case, the top 10 applications, the RSS feed. So we could get an error. If we mistype the URL or there's some other error or we couldn't access it for whatever reason, that can generate an error. And just to show that if I actually delete that temporarily, the error comes back again, as you can see highlighting under IO exception. So we're defining the URL to point to the top 10 apps. So next thing we need to do is we need to use this thing called a HTTP URL connection. We're going to call it connection equals, and we need to type the same thing again, but this time in brackets. Then it's URL, which we defined on the previous line, dot open connection. So what that line of code does, it basically tries to open the URL. So the previous line just defined it and got it set up ready to actually start processing. This line of code actually opens it up. So it physically actually goes off and tries to open that on the internet. And what we can do there is we can actually try and get a response if we wanted to. Just out of interest, we're going to log the response. So we can type int response equals connection dot get response code. Now, response codes are errors that you may have seen before. For example, if you've ever tried to access a page and you get a 404 error, well, that is actually a response code. So what we're going to do there is we're just going to show that on the screen, or we're going to log the response code just for your own peace of mind. You can sort of see what's happening behind the scenes. So again, I'm going to type download data. And just a quick point here, make sure that you type download data exactly the same in all of these areas. And the reason will become apparent probably in the next video when we start actually debugging and using some of this. So I'm going to type the response code was response. So that's going to just log it to the logcat so we can actually see that when we're running the application a little bit later, purely for information purposes. And anything you see in the log.d, by the way, that's really just for you. It's for your reference so that you can debug this and you can get an idea of what's gone wrong and try and debug the problem and actually ultimately fix it. Okay, so next we need to type input stream is equals connection dot get input stream. And this line and the line that's going to follow now are the two mechanisms you need to put together to actually start reading data. So input stream reader ISR equals new input stream reader, and it's going to be IS. So we're defining the input stream, which is again connecting to the connection, which we defined up here on that line. And then we're using this input stream reader so we can actually start processing, and you'll see that processing a little bit further on as we go through. So again, we've just defined the stream. So this is really Java code to start accessing the data. But at this stage, we've set it all up. The first line here, the connection, that actually opened up the connection ready to start accessing data, but we haven't actually started to download the data yet. So what we need to do is we need to start actually downloading the data. So to do that, we need to create two variables. So I'm going to create one called char read. This is the character. We're going to literally read them one character at a time. So int char read is what we need there. And then we also need a temporary buffer. I'm going to call it input buffer. And you can call it new char. And what we'll define is we'll define it 500 bytes at a time. So we're allocating space at this stage to read the file 500 bytes at a time. So depending on the size of the file, it might take 3 or 4 times around to actually download all the data. But as we download the data, we're going to be putting it up here into this temp buffer variable that we defined above. So next we need a loop. So we need a mechanism now to go through and continually trying to read from the file, from the URL I should say, 500 characters at a time until we get to the end, or we get to the last amount, which is less than 500 characters. Once we do that, when there's no other characters left, we know that we can stop and exit. So what we need to do is create that loop. We're going to create a loop. I'm going to create it. I'm going to type while true. So in other words, we're going to keep going through looping continuously, but then we're going to write some code that if we've got to the end, we're going to break out of this. So what we're going to do then is we're going to type character read equals isr.read input buffer. So with that one line of code, what that's going to do is try and read the data into the input buffer for us automatically. And char red returns the number of characters that were returned by this call. So bearing in mind, it'll start at the start of the file, then each time we go through this loop in the while, it's going to read another 500, then another 500, then another 500. So what we're going to do is we want to check to see whether that's less than, which should never happen, or equal to 0. When it reads 0 characters, that obviously means we're at the end of the file and we need to exit out of this loop. So we're just going to type if character red is less than equal to 0, I'm going to break. That's going to exit out of the loop. If it has. So if it gets to this next line, it hasn't exited yet because we've got at least one character. So what we now need to do is store the characters that we retrieved in this input buffer, remembering that we're reading 500 at a time or up to 500. We need to append them to what's in this temp buffer. So to do that, we're going to type temp buffer dot append. So next we need to convert the input buffer to a string. So the way we can do that, we type string dot copy value of. I can type in input buffer starting from position 0 and ending on the number of characters read, like so. So what that's going to do is going to look at and convert to a string and copy input buffer. So again, that's the buffer that we define with every time we actually loop through. Starting at position 0 and going up to and including the number of characters read. So if we've got 500, it would actually read all 500. And the reason we're not hard coding 500 here, so we wouldn't want to do that, is because the last time we actually read the file, the last read, we might only get 20 characters or 50 or whatever. We probably won't get an even multiple of 500. And so we only want to actually store the actual numbers that we've actually got. So that's what we're doing there. We're looping through and actually saving the contents in that file. The last thing we want to do here is we're going to type return temp buffer dot toString. Because temp buffer wasn't a string, but we've defined download XML as being or needing to be a string. So that's what that last line does. So it's going to go right through, loop through the file, read all the data, save it in our temp buffer, and lastly, it's going to then actually convert the buffer to a string and return that to the calling process, which was, of course, the one up here. And that's going to save it in our M file contents, which we can then process a little bit further. So this video has got long enough. So what I'm going to do is pause there. And in the next video, we're going to actually get this up and running. We're going to create a simple test and see if we can download this file and see what it looks like working. So I'll see you in that next video.